Astrology is often accused of being vague. We talk about cycles and seasons and hard transits, but traditional astrology can be different. The astrology I practice and research is often anything but vague. So today we will demonstrate this through a forensic reconstruction of Sylvia Plath's entire timeline through astrology. Crucially, we aren't just looking at the tragedy, though. We're looking at everything: the death of her father, the geography of her marriage, the mechanisms behind her success. A lot of experienced astrologers might stop at the fact that she was 29 during her Saturn return, experiencing an unfortunate six-house year through the timing system of annual perfections. They might say it was destined to be hard. But frankly, that's a little lazy and it's definitely vague. It doesn't tell us why she burned her husband's manuscripts on a specific day in July 1962, when that same year she had just welcomed her second child into the family. It doesn't tell us why the end came exactly 7 months later after a creative burst that is still talked about. So to answer those questions, we have to look closer. We have to use the full Persian hierarchy for prediction: primary directions, annual perfections, and solar returns. I'll also be looking into her astrocartography and, of course, the natal promise itself. But most importantly, I will be demonstrating a precise timing technique that I've recovered for use from the works of medieval astrologer Omar of Tiberias, also known as Umar al-Tabari. The accuracy is astonishing. It has become a staple of my work with clients. See, most people treat the birth chart like a statue, frozen and unmoving. But this technique animates that statue. It shows us which limbs are moving and how. It lets us see the chart breathe and move day by day. So yes, this is high-level astrology, but I promise it won't feel like a math class. I've designed this breakdown to be intuitive, so whether you're a pro or a complete beginner, you'll be able to see how the gears turn and follow along with me. We'll learn a lot about astrology in the process. I'm Solomon Royal, traditional astrologer. This is a deep dive into the astrology of Sylvia Plath. Let's get into it. So this is Sylvia Plath, and for those who don't know, I will give a quick recap. She is one of the most famous poets of the 20th century. She was the author of The Colossus, Ariel, and The Bell Jar. The Bell Jar is definitely her most famous book. Now, she's also famous for how she left this world. She suffocated herself in a gas oven, the one in her apartment. And it is pretty gruesome. Now, she did have a notable life, and she had a lot of happy moments in her life, though she struggled with mental illness for most of her life, which may be in part due to her experience with her father. Her poem certainly suggests so. Now, she was the mother of a couple children, and also the wife of the famous poet Ted Hughes. So there's a lot of interesting things about her. So this is Sylvia Plath's birth chart. There's two anaretic degrees things going on here that immediately jump out. 28 degrees Saturn in Capricorn is a little suspicious. 29 degrees Aquarius. And it's loosely opposed by Mars in Leo at 21 degrees. And there's more to this too. Everyone will notice the 8th house, or the 8th whole sign house, Virgo, immediately jumping out. So before we go further, I have to point out the Moon and Juno conjunction. So Juno is, of course, and this asteroid is really interesting. And asteroids typically have a deep connection with the myth that they're associated with. So Juno is also Hera in the Greek myths, is the queen of the gods, the wife of Zeus. So I'm actually seeing the myth here is that, she was repeatedly scorned in the myths. A lot of the myths are kind of center around Hera punishing or doing some type of retaliation for some way that Zeus has dishonored her or scorned her, right? Of course, there's Heracles or Hercules, who is punished by her for Zeus for being Zeus's illegitimate son, I guess, mothered by someone else other than Hera. This is exactly conjunct her moon to the minute. That is quite the signature. Right there at 8 degrees Libra. So it saturates her emotional experience. The second thing I'm going to point out is that the sun is at the moon's exact degree of fall in Scorpio. That is 4 degrees Scorpio, the degree of the fall of the moon. So what does it mean to be in the degree of the fall of the moon? To have this dry, hot thing there that shuns the needs of the body. It cares only for the solar ideals, like, say, perfection. Doesn't matter how you feel, we have to get this outcome. I think that Sylvia Plath's famous poem, Daddy, really encapsulates her emotional experience with this placement. And of course, we have an exact square between Mars at 21 Leo and Scorpio at 21, or Mercury at 21 Scorpio. So let's look at the last year of her life, because this is some very interesting astrology, and it's just, wow, just so much is going on. So, we'll start with January 1962. This is when her son Nicholas was born. This is her second child. And so it seems like the year is kind of starting off well, right? Well, there's a car crash in June that I didn't put on this slide. This was later admitted to be an attempt to end her own life. July 11th, and really even 9th, 10th, 11th, Sylvia discovers that her husband is having an affair. And she ends up burning his manuscripts and other things in a big bonfire in the backyard. You know, they try to patch it up. It doesn't work. He officially leaves. And then October, by the middle of October, before her birthday in 1962, she's in the house alone, you know, working on her poems, on things that we're still remembering her for to this day. This is very much a creative burst. Then she moves to London, and she publishes The Bell Jar under a pseudonym in January. And then by February, this is just so much going on, right? You know, vague timing techniques don't really cut it here. Transits don't really cut it, because, like, these same transits didn't cause all this before, right? You know? What can astrology really tell us about this? So, the traditional view is, of course, going to be to look at annual perfections. Now, every intermediate astrologer should have this in their toolkit, in my opinion. It's just very easy to pick up and so useful. It's probably older than Jesus, you know, for all we know, right? So it uses whole sign houses, but of course you can still use your quadrant system. You just go through the signs with this one and use that for whole sign for this. So of course, a quick recap for anyone who's unfamiliar. You just go through the houses, or the signs and whole sign houses, one sign per year in a never-ending circle. And it starts on your birthday at the first house in the rising sign. So even if it's 29 degrees Aquarius, the annual perfection starts off as a first house year in Aquarius. And it just goes in zodiacal order, one sign per year. So, you know, for her, it's October 27th is her birthday. So it starts off, you know, on her birthday in Aquarius. It comes around October 27th again, and it's in Pisces. It's her birthday again. So what you want to do is always note the planets in the sign that are activated in the sign. You know, say we come to a Leo year, we're going to be paying attention to Mars. But we're also, of course, going to be paying attention, say, in a Leo year, to the ruler of Leo, the sun, which in her chart would make us look at Scorpio. And this diagram is just taken from AstroSeek. You know, she's obviously very old now, and so the highlighted year, don't worry about it. I couldn't figure out, I don't think there is really a way to change it. You know, I'm pretty good with AstroSeek, but maybe that's for super advanced users. But anyways, if you don't use these, and you know, what are you doing? Why wouldn't you use them if you like traditional astrology? And I even recommend to modern. Like, why wouldn't you use it? And I think a lot of people who do use a lot of modern interpretation will still use it. So anyways, this is classic. We use it for everything. I do. But it's still vague, right? It's just one sign for the whole year. So the idea is that we trigger it. So we use like transits, for example, right? So that kind of works. It does. 1961 and 1962. So mostly the events we just covered, especially sort of the beginning of the end, this downward spiral. That was in a sixth house year when she was 29. So for Aquarius rising, the sixth house and whole sign is Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. Now we already know that the moon is conjunct Juno in the ninth. The scorned wife archetype is activated. But so is the ninth house. And, you know, the ninth house has themes of publishing, for example. That being said, so if we went to a traditional astrologer in the year 1962, I don't think they really still existed then. They would have told Sylvia, you are in your 29th year. This is a sixth house perfection. You know, you're going to experience some domestic problems with the moon centered on relationships, Libra, right? And of course, in astrology, the sixth house is a place of bad fortune generally. It rules illness, servitude, and the daily grind. We can definitely find improvements here. It trines the 10th house, but typically through trial and error and discipline. So it has that sense of difficulty to it, even when positive outcomes occur. And sure enough, that year was very difficult. But by the time she moved into her next birthday, she was already producing masterpieces, as this house trines the 10th. So the traditional view certainly works, and that's why it's the foundation here, right? Generally, explains the mood of the year. Here you can see just how quickly things change, right? This is a really relationship-focused year, right? And can we really get that just from the sign of the ruler of the year being in Libra? You know, considering that we're still in a Cancer year at the end of the day. What if we were already moving through and activating Leo somehow, especially with someone who has such a late degree ascendant, 29, right? The very end of Aquarius. What if we kind of pulled Leo in to the year? And doesn't that make sense? The out of sect malefic, considering she's a day chart in traditional astrology, so Mars is a big problem from her. What if Leo had been activated this year? You know, what if that was a thing? So to answer that, we do need a sharper tool than just the 6th house year. So my solution is directed perfections. Now that is what I am calling a technique that I've sort of recovered reading through Omar of Tiberias or Umar al-Tabari. Now this is essentially moving perfections. People who are very familiar with traditional astrology and use these methods will know what I mean by directed immediately. Oh, we're directing it through the chart at a certain rate. So the annual perfection is now a moving ascendant. It takes 1 year to complete a sign, and it moves through each degree at about 12 days per degree. 12 days and about 1/7 per degree. There is some more exact math, and I'll be going over that in a kind of more deeper video that goes more specifically into this technique. You can read this in Benjamin Dyke's translation in Persian Nativities too, Umar al-Tabari and Abu Bakr. Apologies for how I might have butchered that. That's this book. And he calls it 30-degree perfections or equal perfections. My memory is failing me just a little bit. Project Hindsight has a Latinized translation that is still perfectly serviceable, which is how I actually found the technique and was using it originally, because you can actually read it for free on Scribd. But since then, I bought the book, and Benjamin Dykes makes these great translations, so I always recommend those. And in general, it's just a treasure trove, Omar of Tiberias. There's so much in there. I was looking for a totally different technique related to pregnancy originally, so it's kind of interesting. But anyways, this is from him. I've recovered it. I've used it over the past 6 months or so, especially in clients and in my own life and the life of like friends and my partner. And it's just produced fantastic results. It's very interesting, and it works really reliably. So the crucial thing about this is that we use equal houses to move through the chart. We start from equal houses. So start from 29 Aquarius. So the 2nd house year will start from 29 Pisces, and so on. 12 days and 1/7 per degree. So the ascendant kind of moves like a hand on a clock to the perfected sign of the year. Now, anyone with a rising sign between 2 and 30 degrees, so most people, will experience a dramatic sign change at some point in the year, right? Because it's going to cross over the sign boundary, say from Cancer into Leo. That is the sort of star technique here, and it interacts well with solar returns in particular. And there's going to be much more in-depth exploration and breakdown of the specifics to come in future videos. But for now, we're going to talk about Sylvia Plath, because that is the main subject here. So I will say, to understand the end, you need to look at the beginning, right? So the natal promise of the father for Sylvia is not a very pleasant one. It is definitely a challenging and difficult placement. The sun at 4 degrees Scorpio at the exact point of the moon's greatest depression or fall. That shows a devouring father. Now, her father was Otto Plath, a German immigrant and a biologist, a university professor. He instilled perfectionism and an almost endless questioning of worth into his daughter. Well shown by the Virgo pileup right here. Venus and the last decan of Virgo is sort of it's kind of rough for her. At least Jupiter helps out, but at some point Venus is in a lot of trouble. In general, you can say the solar principle, which also represents the father, is overpowering the lunar principle through that sign, through that signature. And of course, the lunar principle is our body, our safety, our domestic life, sometimes our children, our emotions, that kind of thing. So Otto Plath must have been intense, maybe hidden and looming. The main story about him and the way that he affected Sylvia is that in 1940, he had been refusing to treat an illness for 4 years and had hid it from his family, but it came to life. And he had to get an amputation and he died. This was a type of diabetes that he had just refused to treat. A smart man, a biologist, who knows what his motivations were, it certainly felt like a betrayal to Sylvia and his now widowed wife. And it's hard to see it as any other way, right? Leaving her so early in life. Now, this demonstrates the natal promise of the sun at the fall of the moon, disrespect of the body and the family's needs and emotional needs because of a solar ideal, because he had one way that he wanted to live, and that was how he was going to do it no matter what, even to the end. Perfection and maybe a misplaced sense of duty at all cost. Once more, we see Virgo. Remember, Virgo is the 8th whole sign house. You can kind of see that a little bit easier there if that's more helpful using the AstroSeek charts. I was using the Astrotheros charts, which I will be using for most of the for most of the video. So age 8, 8th house year. So this is the year where Otto Plath reveals his condition and has to get amputated. So on October 27, 1939, Sylvia turned 8th, enters the 8th house perfection year, which is Virgo for her. So surgery, hidden things, death, all these are very appropriate topics that always get put in the 8th house, right? The South Node there makes things a little tougher, So her father's hidden illness comes to light. So if we're using perfected directions, let's now demonstrate this method. That begins at 29 Virgo, right here, the very end. I believe that's a Saturn bound, actually. And it's going to move all the way through Libra until 29 Libra. And it will start at 29 Libra for the next October 27th, for her next birthday. And one thing we want to notice right away is we can look at this. This is waiting for her at the end of age 8. Right before she turns 9, she's going to hit a nasty square with Saturn in Capricorn. This is Saturn. So Otto's dramatic reveal of his illness begins and ends in the fall of 1940. Like I said, he'd been hiding his diabetes for 4 years, which is quite dramatic. The big date is on October 12th, 15 days before Sylvia's birthday. So that's about 1 degree. Well, would 1 degree behind 28 put us? 29 would put us. It would put us at 28 Libra, the last degree of this perfection, perfectly squaring Saturn at 28 Capricorn. Now, one thing I want to point out is that in medical astrology, a backwards square from Saturn, that's Saturn making a square looking backwards in zodiacal order. Libra right here is shown by this red dot, which is where we are with directed perfections, are considered much more harmful in medical astrology. This is the setup for the Saturn event, for the death of the father. The bill for 4 years of ignoring reality has come due. Saturn is in charge in Capricorn at the end of the day. So by November 5th, we have approached Scorpio 0. And the beginning of Scorpio is where the Time Lord switches to Mars, a much harsher planet in Sylvia's chart, who opposes the ascendant with malefic intentions. And we also enter a conjunction with the sun, which we've already explained exactly what this sun is doing in her chart. And here you can see a timeline, just so you can help kind of visualize everything that's happening here. Otto gets his amputation during the perfect square to Saturn on October 12th. Sylvia turns 8. We're at 29 Libra, and I think about 20 minutes in, if I remember right from the chart. By November 5th, Otto dies. And this is right as we're entering Scorpio 0. This method is somewhat fluid. It is not necessarily the most minuscule exact thing, but it is quite precise as far as astrology timing techniques go. It gets pretty dang close to it, as you can see. The natural segue is to talk about Mars now, who we can clearly see is the villain of this chart. Now, Mars is at 21 Leo. He's only 8 degrees away from an opposition with the ascendant. And a lot of people do give a wider orb for opposition aspects. I think we can clearly see that wider orb is worthy of consideration in this natal chart. More importantly, Mars is perfectly square, making a dominating square. That is where Mars is coming from the right, at the heels of Mercury. Really riding Mercury hard, perhaps. So Mars is the out-of-sect malefic in traditional, at least Hellenistic astrology. Because Sylvia was born at day, Saturn is maybe nicer to her, and Mars is a bit more difficult for her. And the other thing about Mars is that he's ruled by the sun at the point of lunar fall. That kind of makes it a bit worse, right? So as we can see, Mars does a lot of harm to her chart. And Mars is a planet of severance and burning. In Leo, it is a fixed, burning, constant fire. It sits in the 7th house, whole sign of relationships and open enemies in marriage and contracts. It is the part of her that attacks herself, opposition through the other. And of course, Mars in the 7th is also a classic indicator of infidelity in marriage. It is not by any means a guarantee for people who have this placement. It's just something that can happen. Now, so we skip ahead into her college year. She's done very well for herself. She's been a great student and a great poet, and a model young citizen. So by her 20th year, we're in the 9th house annual perfection in Libra. And that is just using the traditional, kind of simple way of doing things. She gets selected for a internship at a important magazine in New York City, Mademoiselle. And it was a very competitive situation, and she was selected out of a big group. It was a big moment of honor for her. It really told her that she could set her sights high. Maybe she could achieve a lot, So we get to the summer of 1953. Sylvia's still 20. We're still in the 9th house perfection, using the normal, simple way. And of course, that is the house of publishing and universities, right? Now, on paper, and also of far travels, traveling from where she lived. On paper, this should be the greatest triumph, right? She goes to New York City, she's a guest editor, she's living the 9th house dream. But through Omar's method, we know that Libra technically rules only the 1st degree of this year for the first 12 days. We know that the rest of the year is actually in Scorpio. So we know this is more of a 10th house year that centers around Scorpio events and career and publicity and something that she's publicly seen for and reputation. And we can even see that it starts off bright. We can see that she puts a lot of hard work and was selected, as the sun shows. The sun would have been in the beginning of this year. The first couple months or so would have been, the first few months I should say, would have been heavily affected by the sun as the direct perfections moved over it, infusing Sylvia with its brightness, elevating her, allowing her 10th house to manifest, as she is chosen for this internship, and that was a big stepping stone for her career. So most of the year is in Scorpio. But we got to remember the last time we came to this perfection, right? And she wrote about this period in the Bell Jar. It had a profoundly negative effect in some ways, and she ended up having a negative action. But first, let's start off with summer. Let's see how the astrology lined up with her receiving this honor. This is 217 days after her birthday on October 27th. We're looking at around June 1st. That's an 18-degree arc, which brings us to 17 Scorpio. So remember, we're just taking 18 degrees from 29 Libra. Obviously, that brings us to 17 Scorpio. I hope this makes sense. You can see in the chart where this is, and you can see that this is making a nice, almost exact sextile to Jupiter in Virgo. Also kind of brings in that South Node flavor. And more importantly, it's opposite the solar return, Jupiter in Taurus, which is retrograde. So Jupiter represents this big opportunity. But the South Node shows the toll that it takes on her coming in from the natal chart. And that retrograde is interesting, isn't it? So, how could we have known to watch Jupiter, though? That year, like we said, the perfections were in Libra or Scorpio using this new method. That's Venus and Mars. Why were we looking at Jupiter? Well, this all ties into the whole Persian system with primary directions. And here you can see the primary directions. These were made using the Nibod key on the AstroSeek tool in the traditional module they have. Just seeing that solar return Jupiter making such a close trine to natal Jupiter would have let us know, okay, Jupiter event this year, right? But even more importantly, we just know to watch Jupiter in this time period from September 20th, 1950 to 1954. Jupiter was the primary Time Lord at this time. So the signs pointing to Jupiter in this period are obvious. And we take Umar's method, and we could have just directed to 17 Scorpio to oppose 17 Taurus, and know, hey Sylvia, here's a Jupiter event. So August 24th, 1953, this was her first attempt. This is 301 days after her birthday, so this is about 24.7 or so degrees. And that is, of course, from 29 Libra. So we round that up, 25 brings us to 24 Scorpio. And that, of course, activates the solar return Mercury in Scorpio for that year. As you can see, the solar return is on the outer wheel. and her natal chart is on the inner wheel. Importantly, this was ruled by natal Mars, conjunct Chiron in her 12th whole sign house, which is often associated with mental health problems. Of course, it's receiving that dominating square from her birth chart Mars at 21 Leo, which sometimes is called a killing square. So the math here is pretty rough. And, here you are, 24 Scorpio, so keep that in mind when we talk about this. So here's the thing. Sylvia had received a rejection letter from Harvard a few weeks prior. Everything had set her up for this upward path of success, and this was a huge obstacle in it. And this is around the time the directed perfection would have been perfectly squaring that nasty Mars. Like I said, it was a few weeks prior, so we know it might have been around 21 degrees Scorpio or so. Moving forward, around August 27th, she overdosed on sleeping pills intentionally, hid herself beneath the floorboards of the house. But she was found after a neighborhood search and saved. Now, that search lasted 2 whole days, so this is a pretty dramatic event. She was in the newspapers. It really activated that 10th house theme of being really public, of her reputation being shown, being everywhere. So yeah, she'd been rejected from that Harvard writing course. It likely felt like all that hard work would lead nowhere and wasn't worth it. And as we know, she was just nearing this rough Mars energy, this rough Mercury and Scorpio energy. It was a really probably mentally negative time. Probably felt like she would always be hidden and fighting for survival. Like Mars would cut her down no matter what. Now, crucially, when at 24 Scorpio, we have just entered the bounds of Saturn at 24 Scorpio. Now, Saturn is, of course, still in Capricorn, still in power. Now, he's in the 12th house, showing difficult mental health. Now, the 12th house is called the place of bad spirit of Diamond in Hellenistic astrology. So you can almost imagine in her chart almost like a dark, heavy Saturnian spirit floating above her body. I have a client who had a 12th house activation when she was getting an anesthesiologist certification. Is another way to think about this sort of like right above the body spirit and our mental health and stuff. This 12th house stuff is given power when it's in Saturn's bounds, especially conjunct Mercury at the end of Scorpio, kind of a dark place. And not to mention, this is all perfectly square the solar return moon in Aquarius, which is on the nodes. Kind of near Juno, it's still pretty far away, but still, you'll see this pattern as we move through Sylvia's astrology. Juno's fingerprints are all over this crime scene. So I think that she has a family history of ignoring the lunar side of her, right? Like we've already kind of mentioned with the natal promise, like the father refusing to take proper care of himself or prepare his family. It's that sun, the point of the moon's fall. So it infused this year with a double-edged light, as you can see. But that sextile aspect, and the other thing is we're making a perfect sextile aspect to Saturn in the natal chart here, who is in power in the place of his joy in the 12th house, in his sign, Capricorn. We're in his bound. So we're received by Saturn by the rules of traditional astrology. Now that is likely what made being found and saved possible. This probably is what saved her life. This shows to me that her mental health problem was not a death sentence, but it was a very difficult fight at the same time. So we're going to go through a pretty big time skip here. So skipping ahead a few years, Sylvia more or less recovers and gets accepted into Cambridge and, skips across the pond to the UK to start a new life here. We're skipping ahead to October 1st, 1955. She is about to turn 23. She's about to enter her 12th house perfection year in Capricorn. The directed perfection is going to start at Capricorn 29 on her birthday on October 27th. So she's not there yet. We're more like 27, 28 Capricorn when she lands in Cambridge. So we're actually perfectly conjunct Saturn in her chart, right? So for context, she was in an 11th house year. A place of rewards and honors where people invest into us. That's what the 11th house is. It's probably the best place in the chart. So there she received the Fulbright scholarship to come and study at Cambridge. At the same time, the directed perfection had brought her perfectly to Saturn in charge in the 12th house in Capricorn. So the 12th house part of this is that often people are escaping an old life in their 12th house perfection year and entering a new one. And the 12th house is also connected to huge institutions of all sorts. It's often mentioned that it's connected to hospitals, but I really have seen it show up as huge institutions of all sorts, all shapes and sizes. So in your chart, Saturn and domicile in Capricorn in the 12th house, this is a great symbol for an old and venerable institution of wisdom and tradition, such as Cambridge University. And you can see a kind of old picture. I believe this is where her college was in Cambridge. We see the natal chart playing its natal promise out perfectly well and in a positive way. She's hit a good stride here, right? And in this coming year, she will meet Ted Hughes. Now that is how the 12th house... We know that the 12th house is sort of a bad place in the chart at the same time. Sometimes just bad events and events that will have bad outcomes is a consistent theme in the 12th house. So I think this relationship beginning in her 12th house year is certainly an omen. Kind of shows the teeth of the traditional whole sign method, right? Like you still need to keep that in your mind if you are applying this to your chart or someone else's, that the traditional annual perfection still counts, right? We're going to skip ahead to when she met Ted Hughes. This was on February 25th, 1956. She was 23 years old. This is 121 days after her birthday, which gives us a 10-degree arc. From 29 Capricorn, that's 9 Aquarius, which is right here, this red dot in the chart. Of course, this makes some really interesting aspects with her solar return and with her natal chart. Now, the most striking thing is this perfect trine with a fallen Mars in Libra in the 9th house. In the sign of relationships and the place of foreign people... and Mars is, of course, this dashing young man. And the fallen nature of Mars speaks to the fact that some tragedy is baked in to the very beginning of this relationship. It's like the astrology understands that this relationship is going to end up in a negative place, you know? It seems like the relationship was in some form or fashion doomed from the start here. That trine is just allowing an easy flow of Mars. It lets Mars slip right in. She doesn't fight it at all. In fact, she bites him on the cheek. Kind of sounds like Mars, right? Love that Mercury-Mars conjunction coming through. So it also is making is kind of a loose square, but with 4 degrees is still a activated, you know, within the degrees of activation within the orb of a square with her sun. And we know what the sun is in her chart. We know that the sun is not a nice guy necessarily. So this is the ascendant, the direct imperfection colliding with the Mars-ruled figure from the 9th house, the foreigner. It's passionate, but it is hiding violence. It redefines her identity instantly. Now, and this is also, not to mention the aspect to the sun, she's receiving a dominating square from the sun. You know, it's not... The sun is really more so impressing on her, rather than her being able to even fight back against this. She would later write about how Ted Hughes eventually came to embody her father's ghost, the sun, through abandoning her, just as her father had. I think the sun's cycle of grief secretly plants its seeds here again. But on the omens aside, this is the start of some actually pretty happy years in her life. It's hard to stomach what Ted Hughes would eventually do to her, but for now, let's just take it in. Take her life in, you know? This is a lovely couple for now. I'm a little bit obsessed with these photos, you know? Just look how cute they are together. And she obviously adores him. We have to just once more think about that piece, about that scorned wife saturating the emotional experience. It's like of being left and abandoned by the father figure is the core emotional imprint that she came into this life with. We're going to move ahead to the marriage to Ted Hughes, and of course this happened pretty quickly, right? We're still in 1956. So we come to June 16th, a lovely summer day, or right before summer, I should say. Now this is 232 days after her birthday, and that gives us a couple days into 19-degree arc. So 19 degrees from 29 Capricorn is 18 Aquarius. Look how precisely this interacts with her chart. It's squaring her solar return Venus at 19 degrees Scorpio. And look how Venus is also applying and connected to Saturn at 21 degrees. Now Venus and Saturn, when those two come together, astrologers will, any astrologers watching this video, that's a marriage signature. We want Venus and Saturn to be together to show commitment and love. And Scorpio sadly shows the the fact that Scorpio is ruled by Mars and Leo does show maybe a kind of negative outcome of this, especially in the solar return chart ruled by fallen Mars in Libra. So, but regardless, back to the current time, that shows commitment and love that will transform her in Scorpio. She will indeed be known for this, right? With it being in her 10th house. And of course, this also precisely activates this the solar return nodes, 19 Sagittarius, 19 Gemini. And it also is applying, within just a couple degrees of an opposition from that villain, Mars and Leo at 21. There he is. His fingerprints all over this. But for now, it's a good life. Yeah, and they move to a perfect little cottage, in the English countryside. And this is a golden era for her. She enters a period of motherhood. We're going to look at when her first child was born, Frida. So she was 24 years old. It's April 1st, 1960. This is a 4th house year, starting from 29 Taurus. So this is 156 days after her birthday. That brings us into a 13-degree arc. We're at 12 Gemini. Look at how that's perfectly on her IC, perfectly opposing her MC. It's an absolute perfect activation. It's accurate. It's astonishing, right? So opposing her natal midheaven, in the 4th house, of course, delivers the foundation of her family, her first child, Frida. Before it's a marriage, now it's a family. In the chart, this is applying to a square with natal Jupiter, who gives children, right? In Virgo at 16, at the South Node as well. And the solar return moon is even closer. It's pretty much right up on us at 15 Virgo. And conjuncting all of this, which is also right next to Venus. I mean, once we activate this, we know something good is more or less coming, right? So one thing I want to point out is that Ptolemy talks about how the 10th house is related to mother. In my own chart, this is actually pretty accurate. I've seen it actually really accurate in a lot of charts. I think Ptolemy was right on this. So just something to think about. And of course, the MC, we're thinking about the 10th house. More relevant, though, in some of the biographies and some views of her life, it has been remarked that she had these perfectionistic tendencies. Of course, we know these came from Otto. But we can see how these perfectionistic, that part of her psyche maybe, using psychological astrology, Virgo, all that is activated right here. And we can kind of think of, it was remarked that her perfectionistic tendencies were challenged by motherhood. And I think that's, of course, because no one can be the perfect mother or the perfect parent, even if someone is the best mother possible, just because, life is tough, right? And I think the Virgo activation really speaks to this. I think this started a journey into that Virgo part of her, and those specific challenges around releasing perfectionism. And the 8th house, of course, around releasing the emotional residue, almost shadow work, which we know that, like quite a talented Virgo, she expressed through her writing, through the pen. Now, interestingly, there is a 8th house quincunx aspect. I'm actually not even sure if a quincunx is an 8th house aspect. I've only just started using these aspects because of this technique. It kind of convinced me, these work. So, props to you, modern astrologers. Y'all have some stuff right every now and then, turns out. No offense, right? We're all learning from each other here. But we're making an 8th house aspect with the solar return Juno. Of course, typically Juno, we're thinking about family and mother. And of course, I've shown how in her chart it's maybe a negative type. But here we get a nice version of Juno. Juno is like, yes, here's have a family. And look at these beautiful pictures. Oh, I'm obsessed. So continuing into her golden era, we get the publishing of the Colossus. This is some very straightforward astrology. This is easy this time. It was on her birthday, or just a few days after, on October 31st, 1960. Within the first 12 days of her birthday. So we're just at 29 Gemini, easy peasy. Now, this is a perfect 5th house trine to her ascendant, is the first thing. Of course, the 5th house is creative projects, things that are like children to us. And any creative will know that also interacts with astrology will know that the 5th house has a lot to say with when they get some creativity or in something, a project of theirs is like revealed, expressed, shown to the world. It also opposes, it's only 1 degree away from Jupiter at 0 degrees Capricorn, kind of out of sign, but still, that's a pretty tight aspect. Anyone would count this. And of course, Jupiter has a lot to say about publication in general and expansion. Fall in Capricorn, which has a lot to say about that troubled family history, father, and how much that was a part of the Colossus and how that was a central theme of it, right? We also see, this is at the top of her chart. She's sort of at the height of her powers. A new baby is born, marriage is going well, motherhood is going well, she's publishing works. This is a great time in her life. She's at the height of her powers. Juno nearby does speak to how that troubled family history is such a big part of this, right? Now, this is perfectly square her solar return MC at 27 Virgo. That is, of course, the probably the main, this is how we know something is going to happen in this time period. And that is ruled by Mercury, who is stationing in the solar return. So that also kind of activates Pluto and Mars. It speaks a lot to the father experience and grief involved. And here's one of the covers of it. I believe it had a much more, classic 1960s style when it came out. So we're going to move forward into 1961. I guess this is a few months after. So in the same solar return, February 6, 1961, she has her first miscarriage. I think this is like, a bump in the road that maybe had a bigger effect on her. So this is 102 days, so that's about 8 degrees and a half or so maybe 9 degrees. So we're at about 7 or 8 Cancer using Umar's technique. So this is perfectly squaring her natal moon, Juno 8 Libra, that scorned, that rough domestic experience. We're applying to opposition with Saturn. We're applying to conjunction with Mars, who in the solar return chart, look at that, perfectly opposing. Oof, a rough year indeed. Perfectly opposing Saturn and Capricorn, right? And Mars is out of bounds in the declination, so we know that means he's acting a bit more wild, a bit more uncontrollable. And we're having a perfect 6th house aspect with the solar return ascendant in Venus and Sagittarius. And we know the 6th house is like, health matters, hospital matters in general. I mean, a miscarriage. Wow. Yeah. And we're loosely, this is, you can see this is a rough event. You could easily predict this would be a rough time because of that square. And then you kind of look at all this other stuff that we're starting to activate at the same time and know, okay, we're entering some choppy waters there. So we're going to skip forward, more or less skip through that year. The next, I feel like it might have been a year that involves a lot of grief and a lot of writing and just a lot of domestic living for her. And of course the biographies will go into much greater detail. But focusing on the astrology, we're moving forward into the year of 1962. So we get a new solar return, as you can see. This one is, it's quite a bit different. But first off, we have the birth of a new child, the birth of her son, her second child, Nicholas. This is on January 17th, 1962. This is 82 days after her birthday. This is a 6-degree arc, so 5 Leo. Now, at 5 Leo, we're squaring the natal sun perfectly. A boy, right? It also not squaring, but we're perfectly opposing the natal lot of fortune, which as I've applied this technique to other famous people's charts, to my charts, other people's charts, the lot of fortune, both solar return and natal, is very important for this technique as well. And the solar return has, it has this waxing 5th house moon. That is also just a pretty good indicator of a successful pregnancy, right? So, we got some good things going on here. Nicholas is born. The family's bigger. This is a good thing. But notice where the directed perfection has come to. We are in Leo. We are walking through the sign of fire. We are going to be approaching not just Mars, but the North Nodes and a bunch of other stuff, actually, as we're about to get into. So the stage is being set. This whole year of 1962, this is what most of the project is about, it turns out. So this year started as a Cancer year, a 6th house year, an unfortunate year as we started this whole video with, ruled by Moon and Libra conjunct Juno. We know there's some negative events in store. She turns 29, right? The daily grind is a big part of this. The marriage is straining. Ted is drifting, it seems. Sylvia is eventually left alone with the babies. The mood is really heavy here. The stage is thoroughly set for Mars and Leo to just commit arson on her life. So the first outward sign of this in 1962 is in June, when she has a car crash. She drives off the road into a river, and she later admitted it was an attempt. So this is around June 2nd. The records were somewhat less than exact on this, so I decided to just look at the astrology here. So 218 days after her birthday, we're in an 18-degree arc, which brings us to 17 Leo. This is perfectly squaring the solar return Mars at 17 Scorpio. And this is right around the time when she had her car crash. Look how accurate this is. And we're also tight applying trine to Uranus at 20 Aries in the natal chart in the third house. The third house is, of course, the place of trips, short travels. We know that cars are here, things like this. And the third house in whole sign for her is Aries too, which, is kind of conjured up when you think about crashes, things like that, fast, abrupt, intense things like Aries is sometimes involved with. Now this, of course, begins that tightly applying to the natal Mars and Leo square Mercury and Scorpio as well, because those are at 21, Leo and Scorpio. So I look at this is like a warning shot for Mars and Leo. And you can also see the difference between a solar return activation and a natal activation. Because the solar return activation is this car crash. It's dramatic. It's a big deal, right? It's still an activation. But it's not as big a deal as what we're about to walk into, which is the discovery of her husband's affair. This famous bonfire that occurred in the backyard of her house, where she burned a bunch of her husband's papers. I believe some of her own as well. Maybe mistaken about that. So that's about a month later, a few weeks later, a few degrees later. We're at 21 degree arc at 20 Leo. And this is around July 9th through 11th. We're applying with less than a degree to natal Mars in Leo when this happens. This is no coincidence that this method is at 21 Mars. The symbol is perfectly there, astrologically, for a discovery and affair. Mars and Leo in 7th house, ruled by the sun in Scorpio at the fall of the moon. And this timing system perfectly activates this at the exact time period that she discovers that Ted Hughes has been having an affair on her, cheating on her with Asio Weevil. Use this. Here's some more irrefutable proof of astrology situation as far as I'm concerned. Of course, you can, some people will still call it coincidence, and, well, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But to me, this is an astonishing confirmation of this technique's incredible power. And because it's Mars, the events can sort of jump the gun of the perfect aspect. So we know Mars events happen maybe slightly early, right? And so, anyways, it also seems that just entering the applying range at all, at least in Sylvia's life, easily triggers events with this technique. So this is also the perfect trine from Uranus and Aries, the third house. We know that she found out about this affair through the telephone. And the third house is the telephone, communication, neighbors. It's shocking with Uranus. It's ruled by Mars because it's Aries. Shocking communications around the partner's rash actions, infidelity. And of course, this activates basically the entire solar return because this is the main event. The north and south node, of course. Mercury retrograde in Libra at 23. We're also hitting that sextile aspect. The list goes on. The moon in Gemini at 24. Uranus. Wow. Yeah, there's a lot going on here, not to mention Chiron. And of course, this is the famous bonfire. Of course, that bonfire is shown in the astrology in her natal chart. Mars in the fire sign Leo. Burning, applying that overcoming square to Mercury, to Scorpio. Burning books. These hidden notes and things. Yeah, lands exactly on the planet of burning. Wow. So she walks in the garden, burns the evidence. The astrology is very literal. Very interesting as this point makes a 8th house aspect to the solar return ascendant at 20 Pisces. Very interesting, that 8th house kind of theme coming in there. It also begins the 6th house aspect to the solar return Saturn at 23 Capricorn, which is played out as the marriage kind of unravels. And so that's what happens over the next few months. They had just spent September squaring natal Chiron at 27 Taurus. This was a last-ditch attempt. They went to Ireland to save the marriage. Ted, he just jumps ship. He abruptly leaves. He goes and joins his affair partner, Assia Weevil. I don't know how to say it. I hope I'm saying it right. And that was in mid-September. That was when we were squaring natal Chiron. So it's a foregone conclusion at this point by the time we get to October 11th that Ted is moving out. It's not a question really anymore. So this is a 29-degree arc. It's about 351 days after her birthday. So we're at 28, moving into kind of 29 Leo. And the chart is just, obviously, it's busy. It's busy here, okay? Look, it just activates so much. And Sylvia's life is also busy. But more importantly, we're hitting Uranus on the descendant, perfectly on the descendant, which is another shocking indication on her solar return for the year. It becomes a planet of sudden severance here. The descendant is the angle of marriage, and Uranus here just snaps that structure. And now Ted leaves, and she's left alone. The baby's in her house. So Uranus and Leo has completely torn down the old structures in her relationship life on the descendant here. He always does that. He brings change and surprises, right? Demands transformation as it's ruled by the sun in Scorpio. It's a rough time. But at the same time, Uranus is filling her, through opposition to the ascendant, with lightning bolt inspiration. She begins channeling this disaster into masterpieces. For instance, Daddy was written the day after Ted left, on October 12th. Now, let's kind of move back a little bit. That was a lot that just happened, right? Why did 1962 switch so suddenly? Because we had this relatively happy marriage. It was a nice arrangement up to this point, right? Both of them were finding a lot of success. Careers are moving. Their family is growing. We started the year off with a new kid, for Christ's sake. So what happened between January and June? Primary directions. February 24th, 1962, we enter the Mars period. We are in this period until the end of her life. So this is when Mars took over. And it was going to be a difficult time no matter what for her, unfortunately. And of course, Mars is in the 7th house in her chart, in relationships that harms the ascendant via close opposition, as we've covered. Yeah, wow. It's so literal. And so Mars becomes the primary Time Lord. So we know Mars has the most power in her life at this point, due to primary directions. This is how all of this all works together in the Persian system. I'm giving you an excellent example of how this sort of threefold system works. It's almost like Russian dolls nesting inside themselves. You have the primary directions is the big picture, and then inside that is the perfections and the solar returns. And then we get down to transits, eclipses, things like that. Of course, this is what I do to every chart that I read. This is my bread and butter timing system because it's just so consistent. It works so well. I mean, look at it in Sylvia's life. Mars is also the lord of her 10th house in Scorpio. He also ensured that she made a worthy name for herself while he was in charge too. She's world famous after all. The astrology always shows, in most people's lives, we see the positives and negatives coming hand in hand. That's life. I believe it's the first century Roman poet and astrologer Manilius. I think it's in his poem where he writes, and he references the Iliad, where Zeus is shown as having like two jars, one of good events, one of bad events, and he just pours both in every human's life. And isn't that how fate typically is, right? And Mars brought both things in a big way as soon as he was given power by the primary directions. As soon as we're in Mars's bounds in Aries through primary directions, he takes over. Car crash, affair, also masterpieces. A world famous name. Interesting, right? We get this creative burst. Sylvia, we're making that 6th house aspect to Saturn, right? Sylvia begins her famous 4 a.m. writing schedule. That's a real, hardcore Saturn and Capricorn 6th house routine thing. This is, of course, when she produced the bulk of the manuscript of Ariel. Some of these poems were written while Ted was still there. Daddy, written the day after. Now we get to her birthday on October 27th, and we get a new chart. This is a solar return from 1962, and things are a bit different, especially Venus. So the first thing we get is that we're perfectly squaring just by 2 degrees separating from solar return Venus. Remember, we're separating from solar return Venus. This shows all that dramatic Scorpio Venus and retrograde, showing that it's about the past. It was in the past, but it's still influencing her actions even as she moves forward. Her recent relationship difficulties, represented by Venus and Scorpio behind the ascendant, are the inspiration, the impetus behind the ascendant's forward movement now, especially behind the works and what she's doing, you know? So it just shows how this is still influencing her through that separating square. But another thing that this strikes me is we're really activating sort of the Saturn. This is when we're making a perfect sixth house aspect to the natal Saturn in Capricorn 12th house, and that brings up a lot of themes of mental health. I think that she was really struggling in that old house. Like, how could she still stay there after everything, right? And of course, we know we're about to get to how she moves and leaves. You know, at the same time, Saturn is bringing some positives here. It's forcing her into this self-rate redefinition process, right? That's the dignity of Saturn. I do think it was definitely bringing out that mental health theme, though. In the early 60s, of course, it was particularly rough to get treatment for that kind of stuff. Then we get to November, and we move to London. She moves into W.B. Yeats' old apartment, actually. Kind of fascinating, right? She called it a miracle. So we don't know exactly when she was checking this stuff out. So I believe that it seems to me to reason that it was right around the time that the perfection would have been hitting Jupiter, about a little bit less than 30 days after her birthday. So around like mid-late November. Of course, I wonder if this was the apartment that Yeats, who was famously a magician in a esoteric order called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, kicked the famous Aleister Crowley down the stairs of. A very Pisces place indeed, right? These wizards battling each other here, you know, and then she moves in here. Just funny factoid. Here's a picture of the place. The move-in date was December 10th. So that's 44 days, about 3-4 degrees. We're about 2.6 Virgo to 3 Virgo. We're just moving past the opposition with Jupiter, of course. And we're hitting that perfect sextile with the sun. So, you know, she moves herself from Devon to London. And we're starting to join Neptune in Virgo, which is a little concerning, right? She's also getting ready to publish the Bell Jar here. The 8th house whole sign shows us entering this new shared resources situation with our landlord. It's a 7th house year with whole sign perfections with the old normal system. That kind of brings up contracts, right? I do think she was getting ready to publish the Bell Jar at the same time, as we see with that sextile of the sun in her 10th house. Not to mention the perfection is meeting Uranus perfectly on the descendant, which is, as we know, in her chart natally in the 3rd house, which has a lot to do with writing, sometimes publishing. Now, I have to talk about her astrocartography for a second. You've kind of noticed how England has been pretty crazy for her, right? I think England brings out the worst of Mars and Sylvia's chart, according to the astrocartography. Just a little screen cap taken from the astrocartography with In Mundo aspects, and this is her Mars IC line, which goes right through England, Paris, kind of splits the difference between London and Paris. And we know that radiates out for a few hundred miles, absolutely, in my experience, affecting something as far out as this area. So the IC line for Mars, that brings these Mars themes into her home, into her family, into her foundation, private parts of her psyche even. The truth is that England is simply not good for her. Or Paris, for that matter. Don't run off to Paris. It's not going to be better if you were her astrologer, right? On the other hand, it has been mentioned how she felt a lot better with her career and networking with the English literary scene as opposed to the American one. This kind of shows Mars' power, right? At the same time as ruling over the 10th house, providing some positives as well. So, after her move to London, we move to 1963 officially, and this is the publishing of the Bell Jar. Probably her most famous work. If you want to be like, oh, who's Sylvia Plath? Oh, author of the Bell Jar. And this was actually originally published under a pseudonym, Victoria Lucas. That shows how close we are to Neptune and that murky, foggy kind of thing, that dreamy thing that Neptune does. So, of course, this is 72 days after her birthday. That gives us a 6-degree arc. You know, more like a 6.5 degree arc. So we're around Virgo 6. Now, this is opposite her solar return, Chiron, in Pisces at 6. This is like a painful birthing of her own trauma, right? And remember, Chiron's thing is not just to experience the wound, but to teach about it, to then turn the wound into something that is of service to others. And that's sort of what she does as a writer, as someone who reflects on these experiences for everyone else in a way, in a deeper way than is typical. Of course, at Virgo 6, we're still in a tight sextile with the sun, which is probably the most relevant thing here. I like that we have this really nice sextile to the Lot of Spirit in 8 Cancer. Now, the Lot of Spirit did not jump out in Sylvia Plath's astrology all the time, necessarily. It does in other people's astrology, though. So the Lot of Spirit, Lot of Fortune, they always can be sometimes relevant when we're doing timing, right? You know, we're applying very close to Neptune and Virgo. So the nodes are pretty interesting, too. We have sort of out of the quincunx aspects. It brings to mind how the 6th house aspect, it brings to mind the 6th house is, makes a trine to the 10th house, that kind of thing. Here's what's important here. We've been at Mercury's bounds this whole time. You can see that right here. That section of Virgo, the beginning of Virgo, Mercury is super powered. Mercury is so in charge because Virgo, as we know, is Mercury's sign. Also, Mercury is exalted in Virgo, so double the points, double the kudos. And we're also in the bounds of Mercury while we're in the beginning parts of Virgo. Mercury's the superpower here. No wonder that we moved, and did a lot of moving, and no wonder we had a writing, a literal piece of writing published as well. So the crucial thing to notice here is that after the bell jar is published, we immediately enter the Venus bounds of Virgo. So at first things are going more or less well. Despite the disaster in her life, things are going more or less well, right? The bell jar will become world famous after all. So far, the switch in the Virgo Time Lordship, which happened 12 days after her birthday, some pretty powerful for Mercury things like writing, what contracts. But the thing is, the bell jar is published at the very end of those Mercury bounds. So within a week of publishing the bell jar, Sylvia would have entered the Venus bounds of Virgo. Venus is the most uncomfortable in Virgo, despite it being Earth, because Venus is fallen in Virgo. It's just fallen planets are much worse to experience as a transit than detriment. Not necessarily applying that to a birth chart reading for people, just like as a transit, which is what she's experiencing this as right now, is as a time lordship, as sort of a time system transit, right? So what makes things worse is that Sylvia's own Venus is fallen in Virgo. In a bad house, the 8th house, conjunct the point of lessening, the South Node, and depletion. I mean, this is not a pleasant planet to be in charge of you. This planet has very little to work with. It simply can't help much. Venus simply can't do much to help her. So the fire of inspiration from Mercury, all this writing that she had, all these masterpieces she had in her that she can now put out, well, she's done. The masterpieces are out into the world. The writing's done. That fire, that inspiration from Mercury is now cold because it's completed. What was there left to give her hope? And Venus isn't going to help. It's actually going to hurt this Venus period because she was likely focusing on Venus things internally, bringing her to reflect excessively on relationships, particularly disappointments, such as Ted Hughes' betrayal. So now we come to her final days. This is one of the most striking examples of this technique in action. So we're at a 9-degree arc on February 11th. So that gives us, we're 2 days before the exact 9-degree arc. And she does have 20 minutes into the degree. So we know that it's actually happening a little sooner, than the degrees. But between 7 and 8 Virgo. So we're at 8 Virgo. And we immediately hit Neptune in the whole sign 8th house in Virgo, next to the South Node. Wow. We also hit solar return Juno. Exactly. The grief became overwhelming and likely felt never ending. Neptune is triggered. That's delusions, mental ordeals, spiritual problems at times, manias and depressions, mental illness in general. And the other very striking part of this is that Neptune it rules gas. Neptune rules gases in general. We always give gases to Neptune. What was the method of Sylvia's exit? Gas oven. The other thing of note here is I noticed this in other famous cases that I was applying this to, is that we can direct the 6th house and 8th house and come to and kind of figure stuff out with them. When we direct the 8th house using the same principles of Umar's methods, so remember we're just going eight signs in advance here basically. This is kind of like the idea of derived houses. That brings us to 8 Aries. So 8 Aries instead of 8 Virgo if we direct from the 8th house. Now 8 Aries is perfectly opposite 8 Libra, where the moon and Juno are at. And cruel Juno in this chart. Her fingerprints are all over this crime scene. It's also perfectly trine the solar return Mars in Leo for the year at 8 Leo. And of course we know trines, sometimes they just allow that energy to flow a little too freely. There's nothing in the way of this martial energy from coming in. There's no resistance to this destructive energy. Now directing the 6th house brings us to Aquarius with very similar results. 8 Aquarius is of course very close to the south node and activates the Saturn Mars solar return opposition for the year quite perfectly. Trines the moon, no resistance to the moon. The next thing that we need to note about this end of life is the solar eclipses had a lot to say about this whole sequence of events, the whole downward spiral. On July 31st, 1962, we had a solar eclipse at 7 Leo. That activated her sun. It squared her sun. It was only 3 degrees off, so we know that would have been something to pay attention to. And that is the lord of her 7th. The sun is responsible for relationships. So relationships basically eclipsed. At the same time, we know that eclipses sometimes bring breakthroughs mysteriously in her career. The sun, remembers, in her career experiences a breakthrough. Interesting, right? Interesting. Now later on January 25th, 1963, so a week or two before the final days of her life, we had a solar eclipse that not only activated, it was at 4 Aquarius, look right here. Not only did it activate solar return Saturn, it also activated Saturn opposed by solar return Mars in Leo. And this is a Mars-Saturn opposition that we had activated by an eclipse for her. So that really brought in the terrible sequence of events that would then occur. Looking at lunar eclipses, on July 17th, we have a lunar eclipse in Capricorn. That activated her natal Saturn in the 12th house. Pretty rough. August 15th, 22 Aquarius would have been powerfully activating Mars. That's exactly opposite Mars. So this July 17th, it's just a few days after. So we are already in eclipse season because we know the eclipse season kind of starts a week before. A week before this would have been right around the time that she was finding out about the affair. And then we enter eclipse season. This eclipse is very much concerned with, it kind of leads up to the 22 Aquarius lunar eclipse that is right opposite her Mars at 21 Leo. And we know that we need to pay attention to that Mars because of primary directions, right? So we know when looking at this eclipse, oh my God, something bad is going to happen here. Of course, Mars also rules the 10th house of career. Hand in hand. Relationships and career, we see good and bad. Now on January 9th, this is a lunar eclipse right around the time that the Bell Jar was published. Now 19 Cancer would have been activating by square her natal Uranus, which was in her 3rd house, has to do with writing. Her solar return lot of fortune was activated as well, which was at 18 Cancer, which you can see right here. And also Mercury, not natal Mercury, solar return Mercury, a 17 Libra. A little typo. Oops. All that being very appropriate for publishing a book, a big deal book, right? A lot of fortune showing its positive effect. Uranus showing that's quite unique for the time. I mean, and Uranus goes deeper when we consider the myth. So, and that brings me to the current eclipses. As we now speak, we're moving into an eclipse series that is once again right over Sylvia's ascendant. And mine, actually. At 28 Aquarius, Sylvia's ascendant is at 29 Aquarius. Mine is at 27 Aquarius. This eclipse splits the difference. It's almost like a bridge between our two personas as I look into the astrology of her life. And yeah, I am partially fascinated by Sylvia's chart because our charts are very similar. I also have Mars in Leo. Perfectly square Mercury and Scorpio. But I trade Virgo for Pisces. I'm more of a musician and mystic myself. And the moon was at 4 Scorpio when I began working on this presentation, which I did not plan. It's kind of funny how astrology works, right? So, in summary, the house sets the stage for the perfected directions to pull triggers. And when we cross signs, we often bring dramatic changes. Solar returns are clearly important, but natal activations are even more significant. Now, we also see how this shows timing, not necessarily fate. She is not doomed to hurt herself necessarily, but she was fated to have a time period that was more difficult, where she did not have her work to necessarily distract her to pour all of her energy into, for example. I think it was more like she's walking through a minefield than was doomed. When we use the right tools, we see that chaos has a structure, that there's precision to it. When we use the right tools like astrology, we can be aware of these difficult time periods, right? And I'm sure many have wondered what could have saved Sylvia. I just know that astrology did not doom her to her death. It just showed that difficult period. I do think an astrologer or an especially close friend who is knowledgeable about her astrology could have done a lot to help her, though. So, once more, directed perfections. This is a powerful technique. I really hope that more people look into it, and I'd love if you report back to me on your findings if you do make use of this and find some interesting things. I do make use of this in every one of my readings for clients. It's a primary technique for me at this point. I've been backtesting it with loads of data points. I'm just fascinated with it. I think it works amazing. So I think we need to end the video with some closure, right? I mean, if you're still watching this, you probably have some strong water in your chart to be able to hang with something so emotionally intense. We could all use a good cry now after looking at the biography of this pretty remarkable woman. I mean, my heart definitely grew heavy working on this, but the sheer similarities in our chart, thus experience, that compelled me to just continue digging. My heart was very heavy when I finished up this presentation, and I found some relief in finishing my research by going further into experiencing some of the work of Sylvia and Ted. So I'm going to put that here. Here is a really beautiful poem from Ted Hughes about, I think it was about their family life together. It's obviously about little Frida. And I'll leave this here for you to pause the video and read. Thank you so much for watching. Appreciate you hanging in there and finding something of value in there regardless in what I'm saying. So I'm Solomon Royal, traditional astrologer, and you can follow this channel for more content about directed perfections to come, more big videos. I've got a couple deep dive videos planned for Oscar Wilde and David Lynch where I do the same intense timing technique and treatment for each of them. Please like and subscribe if you're interested in that, if you appreciated the video. Thank you again. And I will end the video with a reading. Sylvia Plath, she reads her poem Daddy. And I want you to think about that sun in Scorpio, the point of fall of the moon, when you hear her read this.
Daddy. You do not do any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or chew. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time, marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where it pours bean green over blue in the waters off beautiful Nosset. I used to pray to recover you, ach du, in the German tongue in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, wars, wars. But the name of the town is common. My Polack friend says there are a dozen or two. So I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ich. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you. And the language obscene, an engine, chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna, are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck, and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I have always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat moustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue. Panzerman, oh you, not God but a swastika, so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot. But no less a devil for that, no, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20 I tried to die, and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack, and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw, and I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root, the voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard, I'm through.